Let's talk about fungal diseases. Arguably, the most important thing that a vineyard manager can do is control fungal diseases. So we'll start with powdery mildew. This is ubiquitous in growing regions around the world. I talked about powdery mildew being a big issue in France in the mid 1800s, and how they figured out they could use sulfur to protect vineyards against powdery mildew outbreaks. Powdery mildew, they call it oidium. Powdery mildew came from North America and it's spread all over the world. And it's in you'll find powdery mildew in every grape growing region globally. At least every economically important grape growing region. There may be some regions that I don't know of that don't have powdery mildew, but they must be very small and isolated. Yeah, so powdery mildew, it's a powdery mildew as it sounds. The sensory threshold for this, we get it on our fruit, and so when it gets into the tank, our ability to smell it then in the wine is not super well defined and how much fruit can be infected with it. So if you look in the literature, it varies quite widely from 1% of the fruit. People can start to pick up sensorial issues all the way up to a quarter of the fruit being infected. I would say in my experience, I've definitely made wine with a little more than 10% of powdery mildew infected fruit. It was Pinot Noir, came out fine. I didn't notice any issue. So yeah, its big issue with powdery mildew with getting it on the fruit really is it can cause reduction. It can cause you to slow down Brix accumulation, sugar accumulation, because the powdery mildew, while it looks like a small organism, it actually becomes a pretty big carbohydrate sink at some point. So it can kind of pull the photosynthates from the vine. So the photosynthates are going into the mildew, not into the fruit. And then the other big issue really is that it can damage the skins and then thereby opening the fruit up to other diseases like botrytis, which we'll talk about. And botrytis is, I think, much more impactful sensorially. But you can have a sensorial impact with powdery mildew if it gets bad enough. And so it can produce like mushroom-like aromas in the wine, and it can reduce phenolics, not like botrytis. So like we're going to talk about botrytis, but botrytis has what's called polyphenol oxidases, which can cause pretty dramatic reductions in phenolic concentrations, but it can still reduce phenols. So you'll get lighter mouthfeel, lighter color. But like I said, the biggest issue really is that damage to the skins that can open it up to like a summer bunch rot like botrytis. Yeah, you can see things like, slight increases in TA. Sometimes people have seen increases in Brix, but really the influence on primary metabolism, so acid and sugar, isn't that dramatic with powdery mildew. It's really more of these things that you'll see if you see any issue with powdery mildew and its sensorial impact on wine. So this is what it looks like, right? So it's just that nice powdery mildew, like on the powdery, like fungus on the top of a leaf. It starts on the bottom of the leaf, and then it's like mycelial mat moves up on the top. Okay, so mycelia is just like a network of little like fungi arms. Okay, yeah, I'm sure you've all seen this. Like I said, and it's on house plants. By the way, if you have house plants and you get this on the house plant, you don't need to spray elemental sulfur like we would. You don't need to go to the ag store and buy like a 30-pound bag of sulfur. Take garlic and crush it up and then put it in water, soak it for 24, 48 hours, and then spray the garlic water on the plant. And that'll act, the sulfur in there is enough to act as like a preventative fungicide. So wipe the fungus off the plant first, like with a paper towel, and then spray the plant with the fungicide, and then that'll keep the fungus from coming back. And just every time you water your plant, spray it with garlic water. So this is what it can look like on young shoots. We can get what's called bud perination, which is when the powdery mildew gets into the bud over winter and then comes up when the bud emerges, and then you get this shoot that's just completely covered in powdery mildew, and that's like a disease center in your vineyard. We don't get a lot of this in a vineyard, But sometimes we do see this, and it's when we see it, we go, oh, all right, this is going to be a problem spot for us this year. Hopefully we don't ever see it because we've controlled powdery mildew enough. But what you can see here is this shoot's a little stunted, and then you get this leaf cupping, this upward cupping of those leaves, and you can see all the white stuff on there. Okay, and then here it is continued. So this is probably a shoot that had bud perination, and it just emerged, and then you have that. And this creates what's called a flag shoot. So these leaves will kind of fall off eventually, and then you'll have, or just be really curled, and then the upper leaf will be uninfected. So the upper leaf will be fine looking, but everything else will be not. So that's the flag. So it creates what's called a flag shoot. This is how powdery mildew looks like on shoots. These are dead mycelia here. So these are like little powdery mildew colonies that have died and browned out on the shoot and scarred the shoot up. Once it's gotten to this point, this is clearly the rest of this vineyard is going to be, or the rest of this block is going to be a goner at this point. This is a lot. By the way, anytime you're taking any course at Cornell and you see professors show you these kinds of images of symptoms of disease and stuff, you're seeing the worst possible symptoms usually. But if you see these, if you're in a vineyard and you see this, and this is the first time you identify a disease, you're too late, okay? So we are looking, as viticulturists, we're looking for much smaller symptoms, the beginnings of symptoms, and so that we can get ahead of stuff. You can also see it on the back of the main veins here. So you see those veins. Those veins are supposed to be like lime green, completely nice and green, but you see that dark bit on that vein. And that's oftentimes what we're looking for as an early symptom is we're flipping leaves over and looking at those main veins and looking for dark spots. And then that's usually the first symptom that will be like, oh, okay, we need to like crunch the intervals between sprays together. So check it out. This is it on a fruit. This is it on fruit. So pretty bad on the fruit. Okay, so botrytis. So botrytis is also a summer rot, or is a summer rot. It's really a complex of things. So as viticulturists, we always just look at this gray mold on the fruit that happens after veraison, and we go, that's botrytis. Botrytis cinerea is probably within that gray mold the major organism of that rot, but it's actually like a complex of like botrytis cinerea and then like penicillium and all kinds of different species of fungi that are in there. But yeah, botrytis is an issue because it has these enzymes, like I mentioned, polyphenol oxidases. There's one in particular called lacase that's in botrytis that can oxidize phenolics. So what it can do in whites is cause browning of white juices and wines. And then in reds, it can drop out color. It can brown it up as well, brown the red wine up. And so you can get less mouthfeel, so less tannin, less color in those red wines. It also can, and this is much more well-defined, it's sensory threshold. So once you get about 5% of your fruit infected with botrytis, then people can start to pick up sensorial issues in the wine, like mushroom-like aromas, as well as the color issues. And then it also kind of breaks the skin up. So botrytis kind of gets in and macerates the skin a little bit, like it gets through around the cells of the skin and kind of rips up the berry a little. And then by doing that, it kind of opens the berry up to other issues like sour rot, which would be like when the fruit flies come and they land on the fruit, and then on their little legs and mouth parts and stuff, they'll have acetobacter, which they'll inoculate the fruit with, and then stuff will start to turn volatile. So you get like acetic acid production in the vineyard. Okay. Now, this all sounds negative. It can be very positive. This wine here is Chateau Yquem, which is a sweet wine. It's this is what we would call a noble wine. This wine here, it comes in a 375 ml bottle, so a half bottle. It comes in a 752, but generally we buy these in 375s. It costs new about $400 a bottle. These are sweet dessert wines. By the way, people always say, I don't like sweet wines. You like sweet wines. You absolutely do. If you don't, you're telling me that you're going against your biological imperative. We like sweetness for a reason. But sweet wines, I can understand some of that where it's like, I don't like, sweet mango moscato. That's $5 a bottle. I can get on board with that. This though, give these dessert wines a try. We don't have a culture of dessert wines in this country, and so I hear this a lot in the U.S. from people that are like, I don't like sweet wines, and when you're about to serve them a sauterne, and the deal is you don't drink a lot of this, right? You drink this with dessert, and it's a small pour. The sugar concentration is very high. It's like I think twice the concentration of what's in Coca-Cola. I believe the sugar concentration is somewhere around 300 milligrams per liter of sugar. So the way that these wines are made, sauterne, and there's other, these are called noble wines. The way that these are, so there's like sauterne, Trockenbier and Auslese in Germany, Tokaj in Hungary are some of the most famous noble wines. The way that these are made is the botrytis attacks the fruit, and then they don't get rainfall. So usually, for botrytis to be a big problem in grapes, you need a really moist environment, really moist, humid environment. And so like things like rainfall or heavy dew sets where you have a lot of free water can induce these botrytis infections. But in these climates where they make these noble wines out of botrytized fruit, what happens is like in sauterne, they get a fog that comes in the morning. This happens in the fall while things are ripening. The fog comes in at like dawn and then breaks at noon. So the fog makes this like heavy dew set on the fruit. Then the botrytis takes hold on the fruit. It gets into the skins, and then the grapes kind of dry up on the vine, and they shrivel and raisin, and they concentrate. And then the fog lifts, and then they're getting sunlight and warmth, and they're raisining down. And then the next day the fog comes in. It keeps doing this. The key is there's not rainfall. All right. So the botrytis is able to take hold, and then the berry can just shrivel and concentrate over time. If there were rainfall, because that skin now is so kind of damaged and brittle, it can slide off the grape. So if the rain comes and then hits the skin, it can slip the skin off the mesocarp, off the meat of the grape. And then that's when you start to get issues like volatile acidity problems. Okay, and that's why you really don't see noble wines being made in the Finger Lakes so much. People do it, but it's extremely difficult for them to do because they have to go out and do individual berry picks. So it's just really tedious, inefficient, and they basically aren't going to make any money from that unless they were using like volunteer labor. But unless they have here in the Finger Lakes, unless you have a really dry ripening period, which is usually not the case here. Usually you're going to get a bunch of rain during ripening here. So if you get botrytis here, you get slip skin oftentimes, and then the fruit starts to turn into kind of a vinegary mess. So it's only in specific climates that you can make wines like these. And by the way, historically, these wines were consumed by the nobility, hence why they're called noble wines. And then you can see that crown there. So it used to be, like I've mentioned this in the history lecture, wine was pretty disgusting until about the 1800s in general. The wine that middle-class folks would have consumed, if there was a middle class, the wine that they would have consumed would not have been, they would have been faulted generally and oxidized, that sort of thing. But the wines that the aristocracy was consuming throughout history were, a lot of them were actually very, very sweet wines like these, because of all that sugar, it acts as like a natural preservative. Okay. So this is what botrytis can look like. It can infect anything, any live tissue. Um, but there it is on the leaf axil there on the shoot, on just a damaged. It needs a little bit of like tissue damage to kind of work, because the tissue gets damaged and that releases kind of water and nutrients for now the botrytis to take hold on the thing. I will say this is not something as a viticulturist that we're going to notice usually and go, that's botrytis. Same thing here. This is on the peduncle. The peduncle is the stem that attaches the rachis here, the inflorescence, to the shoot. And again, this is not a symptom that we generally see as viticulturists and think that's botrytis. Usually, as viticulturists, we don't notice the botrytis until once the fruit softens up, once it goes through raisin and starts ripening, and then we start to see it take over clusters. But botrytis infections do occur. Those infections start earlier in the season, so we start controlling for botrytis before we can even really see it. This is what it looks like on fruit, and this is where we'll start to notice it. So you can see that berry starting to shrivel up a little bit there and get brown. And here it's pretty far gone. This is pretty gnarly, and now you can start to see that that gray mold forming. Okay. Here it is. Here's a close-up for you. A recent infection there. Things are browning up, and then you can see the spores producing there, the gray mold. And then you can see it's releasing juice. It's like macerating the skins, and then it's starting to release juice out of the berries, which is just going to exacerbate the issue because the fungus needs water and nutrients to survive. Okay, so there are other important fungal diseases out there. So downy mildew is a massive one on the East Coast. Downy mildew happens in environments where you have a lot of rainfall. Here in the Finger Lakes, we're getting roughly 4 inches of rain every month throughout the growing season. So downy mildew is a huge issue here, which is why in the Finger Lakes and in New York, people will be spraying roughly somewhere between 12 to 18 times in a season. To put that in perspective, in the North Willamette Valley, we spray in a conventional system, we'll be spraying 8 times in a season. Here it's 12 to 18 times in a season in a conventional system. And it really has to do with the downy mildew. That's the biggest problem. We don't see downy mildew everywhere in the world. But so on the west coast of the United States, we don't deal with downy mildew. So in areas where you have dry growing seasons, like on the west coast. But in areas like a lot of France, Burgundy has a little bit of downy mildew issue, not to the same extent as here. Marlborough, New Zealand has a small downy mildew issue, but again, it's not to the same extent that the same pressure that you have here, which is very high. And also things like black rot, ripe rot, those are other rots that exist in very wet, humid climates like you have here in the Northeast and really all over the East Coast. So why is it extremely difficult to make noble wines in the Finger Lakes? A lot of rain during ripening. It isn't hard to make, it's just hard to sell. Noble wines can only be made in the noble region of France. There is not enough rain during the ripening period. Yeah, a lot of rain. And then it just makes those skins slip off, and then you get like volatile acidity because of other things like the Drosophila, the fruit fly, coming in and vectoring Acetobacter on the fruit. Cool.